The blizzard had hit without warning, covering the Montana wilderness in a blanket of white that seemed to stretch into eternity. Thomas Ingram spotted her just before nightfall. A woman in a tattered dress collapsed in the snow, her dark hair fanning out against the white like spilled ink, her skin nearly as pale as the drifts surrounding her. Thomas dismounted his horse with caution, approaching the still figure with his hand hovering near his holster, old habits from years riding the frontier. But as he drew closer, he saw she was no threat, just a young woman on the brink of death. "Miss," his voice carried away on the howling wind. When she didn't stir, he knelt beside her and gently turned her over. She was beautiful despite the blue tinge to her lips and the frost clinging to her eyelashes. He pressed his fingers to her neck and found a faint pulse. Thomas didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, startled by how little she weighed, and carried her to his horse. With practiced ease, he mounted, cradling her against his chest as he turned toward his cabin. The journey home seemed endless as the woman remained unresponsive in his arms, her breath so shallow he had to keep checking to ensure she still lived. By the time Thomas pushed open the door to his cabin with his boot, snow had accumulated on both of them. The warmth from the still burning fire hit him like an embrace as he laid her carefully on his bed. Working quickly, he removed her frozen outer garments, wrapped her in every blanket he owned, and stoked the fire until the cabin was almost unbearably hot. Hours passed as Thomas kept vigil, periodically checking her pulse and breathing, applying warm compresses to her hands and feet as his mother had taught him to do for frostbite. It was well past midnight when her eyelids finally fluttered open. Where her voice was barely a whisper cracking from dryness, Thomas leaned forward, offering a cup of water. "You're safe now. I found you collapsed in the snow about 5 miles from here." She accepted the water with trembling hands. After a few sips, she studied him with eyes the color of spring violets. "Thank you," she murmured. "You're warm now," Thomas said, pulling the blanket higher around her shoulders. "That's what matters." "I'm Nora," she said softly. "Nora Fallon." "Thomas Ingram," he replied, noticing how the fire's glow softened the angles of her face. "Rest now, Miss Fallon. Questions can wait until morning." But as she drifted back to sleep, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what had brought this woman to the middle of nowhere in a Montana winter of 1876, and what she was running from that was worse than certain death in a blizzard. Dawn arrived with a sky cleared of clouds, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. Thomas had dozed in the chair beside the bed, waking whenever Nora stirred. He rose stiffly to prepare coffee and the last of his bacon, watching as the aroma finally roused his unexpected guest. Nora sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. "How long have I been here?" "Since yesterday evening," Thomas answered, bringing her a steaming cup. "Lucky I was riding back from town when I was." Another hour out there and he didn't finish the sentence. She accepted the coffee, her hands steadier now. "I suppose I owe you my life, Mr. Ingram." "Thomas," he corrected. "And you don't owe me anything except an explanation of what you were doing out in that storm." Nora's gaze dropped to the cup in her hands. "I was traveling to Helena. The stagecoach broke an axle about 10 miles back, and the driver said we were close enough to town that we could walk. The others went ahead, but I got disoriented in the snow." Thomas raised an eyebrow. Something in her story didn't ring true. 10 miles from the nearest town, and they let a woman walk alone in a brewing storm. "I insisted," she said quickly. "I didn't want to slow them down." "And your belongings?" Her hands tightened around the cup. "Lost, I suppose. Does it matter?" Thomas recognized the defensiveness of someone with secrets. He'd carried enough of his own over the years to know the signs. "I reckon not. You're welcome to stay until you're recovered enough to travel. The next stage won't come through for a week anyway." Relief visibly washed over her face. "Thank you." After breakfast, Thomas lent Nora some of his clothes, far too large but warm and dry. She moved gingerly, her body still recovering from the near-fatal exposure to the elements. When she wasn't looking, Thomas studied her. The way she held herself like someone used to finer things, the careful way she spoke that suggested education, the occasional shadow that crossed her face when she thought he wasn't watching. "I need to tend to the livestock," Thomas said, pulling on his coat. "Will you be all right alone for a bit?" Nora nodded. "I'll be fine. Perhaps I could help somehow. I don't want to be a burden." "Rest today," he said firmly. "Tomorrow's soon enough to put you to work." The smile he offered softened his words, and for the first time he saw her truly smile in return. Outside, the bitter cold cleared Thomas's head. As he fed the horses and checked his small herd of cattle, he considered his situation. He'd been alone on this homestead for 3 years, ever since returning from the war and finding his parents' graves. Solitude suited him after the chaos of battle, but now a beautiful, mysterious woman was under his roof, and the cabin suddenly seemed different, like a home again, instead of just shelter. When Thomas returned, he found Nora had straightened up the cabin and was examining the few books on his shelf. She turned at his entrance, a volume of Whitman in her hands. "You enjoy poetry?" she asked, surprise evident in her voice. Thomas shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "My mother taught literature before she married my father and moved west. She brought her books with her." "My father would say poetry is a waste of a man's time," Nora said, carefully replacing the book. "And what would you say?" She met his eyes directly for the first time. "I would say that beauty can be found in unexpected places, Mr. Ingram." "Thomas," he reminded her, hanging his coat by the door, "and I'd agree with you." That evening they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The conversation came more easily now, though Thomas noticed how carefully Nora steered away from personal details. She spoke instead of books she'd read, places she'd heard about but never seen, and asked questions about ranch life that revealed her unfamiliarity with it. "Have you lived here long?" she asked as they sat before the fire. "Born and raised here," Thomas replied. "Except for the 4 years I spent fighting with the Union Army." Nora's eyes widened slightly. "You fought in the war," Thomas nodded, the familiar weight of those memories settling on him. "Enlisted at 19, saw things no man should see." He stared into the flames. "Came back to find both my parents gone. Influenza took them while I was away." "I'm sorry," Nora said softly. Thomas shrugged. "Been on my own since. This land is all I have left of them." "It's beautiful land," Nora offered, and something in her voice made him look at her more closely. "What about you? You have family waiting in Helena?" The question hung in the air, and Thomas watched as Nora seemed to debate with herself before answering. "No," she finally said. "No one's waiting for me." Before Thomas could press further, Nora yawned, clearly exhausted despite having spent most of the day resting. He helped her back to the bed, insisting again that she take it while he made do with a bedroll on the floor. As Thomas lay awake, listening to Nora's steady breathing across the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble had followed her to his doorstep. And yet, something about her presence had already begun to fill a void he hadn't fully acknowledged existed. 3 days passed in a similar fashion. The weather remained clear but bitterly cold, keeping them mostly confined to the cabin. Nora regained her strength quickly, soon insisting on helping with the cooking and other chores. Thomas found himself enjoying her company more than he cared to admit. On the 4th morning, Thomas woke to find Nora already up, attempting to make biscuits. Flour dusted her borrowed shirt and a smudge of it adorned her cheek. She looked up at his approach, her expression sheepish. "I wanted to thank you," she explained, "though I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook." Thomas laughed, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. "Let me help before you burn down my cabin." Standing beside her at the small table that served as his kitchen workspace, Thomas guided her hands through the process of mixing and kneading the dough. He was acutely aware of her nearness, the scent of lavender that somehow still clung to her hair despite days in his cabin, and the softness of her hands beneath his calloused ones. When the biscuits were finally in the oven, Nora turned to him with a smile that transformed her face. "Thank you for your patience. I've never had much opportunity to learn cooking." "What did you do then?" Thomas asked. Before ending up in my snowdrift, the familiar shadow crossed her face, but this time she didn't completely dodge the question. I was a companion to a wealthy woman in St. Louis. I read to her, wrote her correspondence, managed her social calendar. Sounds respectable enough. Why leave? Nora busied herself with wiping flour from the table. Her son returned from Europe. He had expectations of my position that I wasn't willing to fulfill. Thomas felt a surge of anger on her behalf. He forced himself on you, he tried, Nora said quietly. I left that night, took the first westbound train I could afford. It wasn't the whole story, Thomas was certain of that, but it explained enough of her wariness. He won't find you here, he said firmly. Nora's smile was sad. Perhaps not. But then I can't stay here forever, can I? The question hung between them, neither willing to address the implications. Instead, they turned their attention to the biscuits, which emerged from the oven golden brown and surprisingly edible. Later that day, Thomas took Nora outside to show her around the ranch. The cold air brought color to her cheeks as he introduced her to his horses and the few cattle he kept near the cabin in winter. You do all this work alone? Nora asked, watching as he distributed feed. Thomas nodded. Hire help during roundup and branding season, but otherwise it's just me. My father ran 50 head of cattle. I'm down to 30 now, but I'm building back up slowly. It's a good life, Nora said, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Honest work, freedom. Lonely sometimes, Thomas admitted, surprising himself with his candor, but peaceful. After the war, that's what I needed most. Nora studied him for a long moment. You've seen much suffering, haven't you? More than my share, Thomas agreed. But that's behind me now. As they walked back to the cabin, Nora slipped on a patch of ice. Thomas caught her instinctively, his arm going around her waist. For a moment they stood frozen, faces inches apart, his hand steady on her back, hers gripping his shoulders. Thank you, she whispered, making no move to step away. Thomas was suddenly very aware of how long it had been since he'd held a woman, how perfectly she seemed to fit against him. Seems I'm always catching you, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Her eyes searched his face. I'm glad it was you who found me. A gust of wind broke the moment, and Thomas reluctantly released her. They returned to the cabin in silence, but something had shifted between them, like the first tentative thaw after a long winter. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Thomas brought out his father's old fiddle. Do you mind? He asked, suddenly self-conscious. Nora's face lit up. Please do. I haven't heard music in months. Thomas positioned the instrument under his chin and began to play, the familiar motions returning despite years of neglect. He started with a slow, mournful tune his father had taught him, one that spoke of longing and homecoming. As he played, he watched Nora's eyes close, her expression one of pure contentment. When he finished, she opened her eyes and smiled at him with such warmth that something inside his chest seemed to crack open. That was beautiful, Thomas. It was the first time she'd used his given name without prompting, and the sound of it in her gentle voice affected him more than he cared to admit. He cleared his throat. My father played every evening, said music kept the darkness at bay. He was right, Nora said softly. Will you play something else? Thomas nodded and began a livelier tune, a dance his mother had loved. To his surprise, Nora rose to her feet and began to move in time with the music, her borrowed clothes swirling around her as she danced in the firelight. Her face was transformed by joy, and Thomas found it hard to keep playing as he watched her. When the song ended, they were both breathless, he from the effort of playing after so long, she from dancing. Nora laughed, a free, uninhibited sound that Thomas realized he'd never heard from her before. I haven't danced in years, she admitted, settling back beside him. Not since before. She trailed off, and Thomas sensed another piece of her story hovering just out of reach. Before what? He prompted gently. Nora's smile faded. Before my father lost everything in bad investments. Before my mother died of grief. Before I had to find work as a companion instead of making the advantageous marriage they'd planned for me. The words tumbled out as if she'd held them back too long. Thomas set the fiddle aside and took her hand, his touch light but reassuring. "I'm sorry for your losses." Nora looked down at their joined hands. "The woman I worked for, Mrs. Hargrove, she was kind enough, but her son—" She shuddered. "When I refused him, he threatened to tell everyone I'd stolen from them. No one would have believed my word over his." "So you ran," Thomas finished for her. She nodded. "With little money and only the clothes I was wearing, I thought if I could reach Helena, I might find work as a schoolteacher. I have enough education for that, at least." "Is that what you want, to teach?" Nora's gaze turned distant. "What I want?" She laughed softly. "I haven't thought about what I want in a very long time, just what I need to survive." Thomas squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Maybe it's time to start thinking about it again." That night, as Thomas tried to sleep on his bedroll, he found himself more restless than usual. Nora's story had affected him deeply, stirring protective instincts he'd thought long buried. The thought of her alone and vulnerable, pursued by a man who would destroy her reputation to satisfy his own desires, made his blood boil. But there was something else, too, an attraction he couldn't deny, growing stronger with each day she spent under his roof. Thomas had resigned himself to a solitary life after returning from the war, convinced that the things he'd seen and done had made him unfit for domestic happiness. Now, Nora's presence challenged that assumption, awakening feelings he'd thought long dead. A week passed, then two. The stage had come and gone twice, but neither of them mentioned it. Nora had gradually assumed more duties around the cabin, proving herself a quick learner despite her sheltered upbringing. Thomas taught her to make simple meals, to card wool from his small flock of sheep, to identify the tracks of animals in the snow. In the evenings, they would read aloud from his mother's books, or Thomas would play the fiddle while Nora sang songs from her childhood. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing pieces of their pasts bit by bit, building a bridge of understanding between them. One evening, as they sat before the fire, Thomas found himself telling Nora about the worst day of the war, the day he'd watched his best friend die at Gettysburg. He'd never spoken of it to anyone, but the words came easily now with her quiet presence beside him. "I held him as he died," Thomas said, staring into the flames. "He asked me to tell his mother he wasn't afraid, but I saw his eyes, Nora. He was terrified." Nora's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own. "You gave him comfort in his final moments. That's all any of us can hope for." "I wrote to his mother afterward, told her he died a hero." Thomas shook his head. "I couldn't tell her the truth, that he died crying for her, covered in mud and blood in a field far from home." "You showed mercy," Nora said softly, "to both of them." Thomas looked at her then, struck by the understanding in her eyes. Without thinking, he reached out to touch her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. Nora leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Nora," he whispered, her name a question and a plea all at once. She answered by closing the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss so gentle it nearly broke him. Thomas pulled her closer, his hand sliding into her hair as the kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and needful. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't plan this," he said roughly. Nora smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Nor did I, but I'm not sorry." "Neither am I," Thomas admitted, "but you should know. I'm not a man of means, Nora. This ranch, these few cattle, it's all I have to offer." "Do you think I care about that?" she asked, pulling back to look into his eyes. "After everything I've seen of wealth and the cruelty it can breed, what do you care about then?" Nora's expression softened. "Kindness, honor, the way you treat your animals with respect, the way you play your fiddle with your eyes closed, feeling every note, the way you found a half-dead woman in the snow and brought her home instead of leaving her to fate." Thomas kissed her again, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't express in words. When they separated, he said simply, "Stay with me, Nora, not just until spring. Stay." Before she could answer, a pounding at the door startled them both. Thomas reached instinctively for his rifle, motioning for Nora to move behind him. "Who's there?" he called. "Thomas Ingram, it's Sheriff Wade from Helena. Open up." Thomas exchanged a worried glance with Nora, whose face had gone pale. He opened the door to find the sheriff and two other men on horseback, their breath clouding in the cold night air. "Evening, Sheriff. What brings you out this far in winter?" The sheriff, a burly man with a graying mustache, dismounted stiffly. "Looking for a young woman. Goes by the name Nora Fallon. Word is the stage driver dropped her near here about a month back." Thomas felt Nora's presence behind him, though he didn't turn. "What she wanted for? Theft, according to this gentleman." The sheriff gestured to one of his companions, a well-dressed man who regarded the cabin with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Edward Hargrove came all the way from St. Louis to find her. Says she stole jewelry worth a small fortune from his mother." The man Hargrove stepped forward, his expensive coat marking him as out of place in the Montana wilderness. "Indeed. The ungrateful wretch repaid my mother's kindness by stealing her diamond necklace. When confronted, she fled." Thomas felt Nora's hand on his back, a silent plea. Making a swift decision, he stepped fully into the doorway, blocking the view inside. "Haven't seen any young women out this way, Sheriff, not since before the first snow." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You live alone, Ingram?" "I do." "Then you won't mind if we come in and warm ourselves." "It's a cold ride back to Helena." Before Thomas could refuse, Hargrove pushed forward. "I insist. We've been searching for weeks." Thomas's hand tightened on his rifle, but violence would only make things worse. With resignation, he stepped aside, praying Nora had hidden herself. The men entered, stomping snow from their boots. Thomas breathed a silent sigh of relief when he saw that Nora had vanished, likely into the small root cellar accessed through a trapdoor beneath the rug. "Nice place you've got," the sheriff said, looking around. "Bit large for one man, though." Thomas shrugged. "Built it with my parents in mind. They passed before they could enjoy it." Hargrove was examining the cabin with suspicious eyes. "Is that a woman's shawl?" he asked suddenly, pointing to a worn garment draped over a chair one Thomas had purchased in town for Nora when the weather turned milder. "My mother's," Thomas lied smoothly. "Keep it to remember her by." The sheriff seemed satisfied, but Hargrove continued to prowl the cabin. He paused by the table where two cups sat from the evening tea. "You always set two places when you dine alone, Ingram." Thomas maintained his composure. "Just hadn't cleared away from earlier." Hargrove's eyes narrowed, but before he could comment further, a noise from below drew everyone's attention, a muffled cough that clearly came from beneath the floorboards. "What was that?" Hargrove demanded. "Rats," Thomas said quickly. "Been meaning to set more traps." But the sheriff was already moving toward the sound, his hand on his gun. "Move the rug," he ordered. Thomas knew resistance would only make things worse. Reluctantly, he pulled back the rug, revealing the trapdoor to the root cellar. The sheriff yanked it open, and a moment later Nora emerged, her chin held high despite the fear in her eyes. "Well, well," Hargrove said, his tone venomous. "The thief reveals herself." "I stole nothing," Nora said firmly. "You know that, Edward." Thomas moved to stand beside her. "This man threatened her. She fled for her safety, not because she stole anything." The sheriff looked between them, clearly uncertain. "That true, miss?" Before Nora could answer, Hargrove cut in. "She's obviously bewitched this poor rancher with her lies." "Sheriff, I have a warrant for her arrest signed by a judge in St. Louis. Your duty is clear." The sheriff reluctantly produced the paper. "I'm afraid he's right, Miss Fallon. I have to take you in." "She's not going anywhere," Thomas said, stepping between Nora and the men. "Not with him." "Don't make this difficult, Ingram," the sheriff warned. "I've known you since you were a boy. Don't throw away your good name for a woman you barely know." "I know enough," Thomas insisted. "I know she came here with nothing but the clothes on her back. I know she's worked alongside me these past weeks without complaint, and I know a desperate man when I see one." He fixed Hargrove with a hard stare. "What really happened in St. Louis, Hargrove?" The well-dressed man's face flushed with anger. "How dare you question my integrity?" This woman is a thief and a liar, and she'll hang for it when we return to Missouri." "No," Nora said, her voice stronger now. "I won't let you destroy me to protect your reputation, Edward." She turned to the sheriff. "This man attempted to force himself on me. When I refused, he threatened to ruin me. There was no theft. The necklace he claims I stole is locked in his mother's jewelry box. If it's missing, he took it himself to create this false accusation." The sheriff frowned. "Serious claims on both sides." "I'm afraid I still have to take you to Helena, miss. The judge there can sort it out." "Then I'm coming too," Thomas said firmly. Hargrove sneered. "How touching. The cowboy defends the whore." Thomas moved so quickly that no one had time to react. His fist connected with Hargrove's jaw, sending the man sprawling. "You'll apologize to the lady," he growled, standing over him. The sheriff intervened, pulling Thomas back. "That's enough. All of you, calm down before someone gets shot." Hargrove rose, wiping blood from his lip. "I'll see you hang alongside her, rancher." "No, you won't," came a new voice from the doorway. All eyes turned to find a petite, elderly woman entering the cabin, supported by the third member of the sheriff's party. She was wrapped in furs and looked exhausted from travel, but carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Mother," Hargrove exclaimed, "what are you doing here? You should be resting at the hotel." Mrs. Hargrove fixed her son with a withering stare. "I should be home in St. Louis, not dragged across the country on this vendetta of yours." She turned to Nora, her expression softening. "My dear girl, I've been beside myself with worry since you disappeared." Nora stepped forward, confusion written across her face. "Mrs. Hargrove, you came all this way." "When I discovered what Edward had done, the lies he told about you, I insisted on coming to make things right." The elderly woman turned to the sheriff. "There was no theft, Sheriff. My necklace is safely in my possession. I can produce it if you wish to see it." The sheriff looked bewildered. "Then why the warrant?" "My son obtained it through deception, using his connections to the judge. A fact I intend to make known upon our return." Mrs. Hargrove's voice was steel beneath velvet. "The warrant is based on false accusations and should be considered void." Hargrove's face had turned ashen. "Mother, you don't understand. This woman was a companion who served me faithfully," Mrs. Hargrove interrupted. "Until you drove her away with your unwanted advances. Did you think I was too old or too ill to see what was happening in my own home?" The sheriff folded the warrant and tucked it away. "Seems to me this is a family matter, not a legal one, if there was no theft." "There was not," Mrs. Hargrove confirmed. "And I would appreciate it, Sheriff, if you would escort my son back to Helena immediately. I fear his presence here will only cause more trouble." Hargrove looked around wildly, realizing he had lost control of the situation. "This isn't over," he hissed at Nora. "You'll regret this, all of you." The sheriff took Hargrove's arm firmly. "That's enough, we're leaving now." He looked at Mrs. Hargrove. "What about you, madam?" The elderly woman glanced at Nora. "With your permission, my dear, I would like to rest here tonight before traveling back tomorrow. The journey has been most taxing." Nora looked to Thomas, who nodded without hesitation. "Of course you can stay, Mrs. Hargrove. I'll prepare a place for you to rest." As the sheriff escorted a fuming Hargrove outside, Thomas felt the tension drain from his body. He turned to Nora, who stood trembling with relief and lingering fear. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she buried her face against his chest. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe now." Mrs. Hargrove watched them with a knowing smile. "I see you've found protection, Nora, and perhaps more." Nora pulled back slightly, though she remained within the circle of Thomas's arms. "Mrs. Hargrove, this is Thomas Ingram. He saved my life when I was lost in the snow. And she's been brightening mine ever since," Thomas added, his voice rough with emotion. The elderly woman nodded approvingly. "I always knew you deserved better than the life fate dealt you, my dear. Perhaps Providence had a hand in leading you here." Later, after Mrs. Hargrove had been settled comfortably in Thomas's bed and provided with a hot meal, the three of them sat before the fire. The elderly woman explained how she had discovered her son's deception and despite her frail health, insisted on coming to clear Nora's name. "I could not bear the thought of you suffering for his sins," Mrs. Hargrove told Nora. "When I confronted him, he confessed everything: how he had tried to force his attentions on you, how you had fled, how he had invented the theft to punish you for rejecting him." "Why would he go to such lengths?" Thomas asked, his arm protectively around Nora's shoulders. Mrs. Hargrove sighed. "My son has always believed he could possess whatever he desired." Nora's refusal wounded his pride more than his heart. She reached out to pat Nora's hand. "I am so sorry, my dear. I never should have left you vulnerable to his advances." "You couldn't have known," Nora assured her. "You were always kind to me." "And now?" Mrs. Hargrove asked, looking between the two of them. "What will you do?" Thomas and Nora exchanged a glance, a world of unspoken feeling passing between them. "I've asked Nora to stay," Thomas said simply. Nora's smile was radiant. "And I've decided to accept." Mrs. Hargrove nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. "Then I believe everything has worked out as it should. But Nora, dear, you must allow me to provide you with a proper trousseau. Consider it compensation for your ordeal." "That's very generous," Nora began, "but I insist," the elderly woman said firmly. "I've no daughter to bestow these things upon, and Edward's wife is a cold woman who has never warmed to me. Let me do this one thing for you." Thomas squeezed Nora's hand. "Accept her kindness, Nora. You deserve it." As the evening wore on, Mrs. Hargrove's eyelids began to droop and Thomas helped her to bed. When he returned, he found Nora standing by the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, coming to stand behind her. Nora leaned back against him, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin. "I was just thinking how strange life is. A month ago I was fleeing for my life, certain I had no future. Now, Thomas prompted, his arms encircling her waist. Nora turned in his embrace to face him. "Now I'm standing here with a man who found me sleeping in the snow and brought me back to life in more ways than one." Thomas brushed a strand of hair from her face, marveling at how completely she had transformed his solitary existence. "When I saw you lying there that day, something told me my life was about to change forever." "And has it?" Nora asked softly. "In every way that matters," Thomas answered, bending to kiss her with all the tenderness in his heart. Spring arrived early that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots beneath. With Mrs. Hargrove's blessing and generous wedding gift, Thomas and Nora were married in Helena by the local minister, a simple ceremony attended by a few ranchers Thomas had befriended over the years, and Mrs. Hargrove herself, who had postponed her return to St. Louis for the occasion. "You look beautiful," Thomas whispered as they stood together before the minister, Nora radiant in a simple white dress that Mrs. Hargrove had insisted on purchasing for her. "I feel beautiful," Nora whispered back. For the first time in years. After the ceremony, Mrs. Hargrove embraced them both. "I must return to St. Louis tomorrow," she said, "but know that you always have a friend there should you need one." "Thank you for everything," Nora said, holding the older woman's hands. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "Be happy," Mrs. Hargrove said simply. "That is repayment enough." As for Edward Hargrove, they learned he had returned to St. Louis in disgrace, his mother having revealed his deception to their social circle. The scandal effectively ended his aspirations for a political career he had been cultivating. Thomas and Nora returned to the ranch, now truly their home. With spring came new calves, expanding their herd, and Nora proved surprisingly adept at ranch life once given the chance to learn properly. Her education also proved valuable when they began selling their cattle. Her neat bookkeeping and shrewd business sense helped them negotiate better prices than Thomas had ever managed on his own. In the evenings, they continued their tradition of reading aloud or making music together. Sometimes they would simply sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in impossible colors, Thomas's arm around Nora's shoulders, her head resting against him. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked one such evening, 6 months after their wedding. Giving up a life in the city for this? Nora looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. How could I regret finding exactly where I belong? Thomas kissed her, still marveling that this remarkable woman had chosen to share his life. When they separated, Nora took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. Besides, she said softly, this ranch will need another hand soon enough. It took Thomas a moment to understand her meaning. When he did, joy unlike anything he'd ever known flooded through him. A baby, you're certain? Nora nodded, her eyes bright with happy tears. The doctor in Helena confirmed it yesterday when I went to town with Mrs. Peterson. We'll become 3 by winter. Thomas gathered her in his arms, lifting her feet off the ground in his excitement. Nora Ingram, you have made me the happiest man in the territory. Their son, William, was born on a clear December night, entering the world with a robust cry that made the midwife laugh. Strong lungs on this one, she declared as she placed the swaddled infant in Nora's arms. Thomas stood beside the bed, overcome with emotion as he looked at his wife and newborn son. The cabin that had once seemed too large and empty for one man now felt like it could barely contain the joy within its walls. He has your eyes, Nora said softly, tracing a gentle finger along the baby's cheek. And your spirit, I'd wager, Thomas replied. Poor child won't stand a chance with us as parents. Nora laughed, the sound of pure happiness. Come here, she said, patting the space beside her on the bed. Thomas sat carefully, putting his arm around her shoulders as they gazed at their son. Did you ever imagine this? Nora asked, leaning her head against him. That day you found me in the snow, Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. Not even in my wildest dreams. I was just trying to save a life, not knowing it would be my own that ended up saved. As William grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy boy with his father's serious expression and his mother's quick laugh, the Ingram ranch prospered. Thomas expanded their herd, and with the profits, they added a new wing to the cabin, creating a proper bedroom for their son and a small library filled with books that Nora ordered from as far away as Boston. 3 years after William's birth, Nora presented Thomas with a daughter they named Elizabeth, after his mother. The following spring brought another surprise, a letter from Mrs. Hargrove informing them that she had left her entire estate to Nora in her will. She passed peacefully in her sleep, Thomas read aloud from the lawyer's accompanying letter. Her final wish was for you to use her legacy to build the life you desire, whether that be expanding your ranch or establishing something new. Nora wiped tears from her eyes. She gave me so much already, her protection, her blessing, her friendship. What shall we do with the inheritance? Thomas asked, setting the letter aside. Nora considered for a moment. Part of it should go toward William and Elizabeth's education, and perhaps, she hesitated, perhaps what? Thomas prompted. I've been thinking about the children in this area. The nearest school is 20 miles away. Many of them receive no formal education at all. Thomas smiled, understanding immediately. You want to build a school? Nora nodded eagerly. A small one to start. We could use part of the inheritance to construct the building and hire a teacher. Or you could teach, Thomas finished for her. Using that education you once thought would make you a school teacher in Helena. Would you mind? Nora asked. It would mean less time for the ranch. Thomas took her hands in his. Nora, whatever makes you happy makes me happy. Besides, William's nearly old enough to start taking on some responsibilities, and I can hire more help now that the herd is larger. The Ingram School opened its doors the following year, a modest building constructed halfway between their ranch and the nearest settlement. Nora taught children from ages 6 to 16, adjusting her lessons to their varying levels of education. Thomas often rode over at the end of the day to escort her home, watching with pride as she bid farewell to her students, each one receiving a personal word of encouragement. One winter evening, 10 years after Thomas had found Nora in the snow, they sat before the fire in their expanded cabin. William, now 9, was reading to 7-year-old Elizabeth, his voice serious as he worked through a passage from Robinson Crusoe. Nora leaned against Thomas, his arm around her as it had been countless evenings before. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life," she murmured, watching their children, having second thoughts. Thomas teased, pressing a kiss to her hair, now showing the first threads of silver. Nora smiled up at him. "Never. I was just remembering what you said to me when I first woke up in your cabin." "You're warm now," Thomas recalled softly. Nora nodded. "I didn't understand then how true that would become. Not just physical warmth, but the warmth of being loved, of belonging, of creating a family together." "Best decision I ever made," Thomas said, "bringing you home that day." "Even better than expanding the east pasture," Nora teased, referencing a recent improvement to the ranch that Thomas had been particularly proud of. He laughed, the sound still coming more easily after years with Nora than it ever had before her. "Even better than that, though it was a close call." Nora swatted his arm playfully before settling back against him. Outside, snow was falling again, blanketing the ranch in pristine white much as it had been the day they met. But inside, surrounded by the family they had built together, neither Thomas nor Nora felt anything but warmth. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. William, at 18, began taking on more responsibility for the ranch, showing his father's aptitude for working the land. Elizabeth, bright and curious like her mother, excelled at the school Nora had founded, which had grown to serve nearly 30 children from the surrounding area. On the 15th anniversary of the day Thomas had found Nora in the snow, he surprised her with a special gift, a silver locket containing miniature portraits of William and Elizabeth, with an inscription on the back, "For the woman who brought warmth to our lives." As they stood together on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, Nora opened the locket and smiled at the images of their children. "They're growing up so fast," she said wistfully. "William talks of nothing but expanding the ranch, and Elizabeth has her heart set on attending that women's college back east. They'll follow their dreams," Thomas said. "As we did." Nora looked up at him, the years having only deepened the love between them. "Our dreams found us, I think." "That day in the snow, what were the chances that you would ride by at exactly the right moment?" Thomas pulled her close, remembering the desperate fear he had felt upon finding her half buried in the drift, and the overwhelming relief when she had opened her eyes. "Providence, Mrs. Hargrove called it. I'm inclined to agree." "Whatever it was," Nora said softly, "I thank God for it every day." As twilight deepened around them, Thomas thought about the solitary man he had been before finding Nora, a man who had survived war and loss but had stopped expecting happiness. He had built his life around duty and work, convinced that was all that remained for him. Then a snowstorm had changed everything, bringing him not just a woman to love but a second chance at living fully. Together, they had created not just a family but a legacy in their children, in the school that educated the next generation, in the ranch that had grown and prospered under their care. "I love you, Nora Ingram," Thomas said simply, words he had spoken thousands of times over their years together, but that never lost their meaning. Nora smiled up at him, her face still beautiful to him despite the lines that time had etched around her eyes and mouth. "And I love you, Thomas Ingram. My rescuer, my husband, my home." As they stood together watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Thomas reflected that some journeys begin in the most unexpected ways, his with a woman sleeping in the snow and the words that had started it all. "You're warm now."